Thank you very much. For anyone who's been here for the last couple of days, I think you've heard me on many occasions stress that we now, after some 5 years of the six-party process, have rather demonstrable evidence that North Korea does not want to give up its nuclear weapons. It does not want to give up its nuclear programs, and that it does not want to give them up for all the incentives and for all the elements that were included in the September 05 joint statement. As you know, those elements included an overall process of seeking cross-recognition of all countries in the region, of a peace treaty on the Korean Peninsula, of massive economic and other forms of assistance. They did not want to give up those weapons, even with the provision of electricity, nor were they prepared to give up their weapons with the promise that at an appropriate time, once they're back in the NPT in good standing, we would even discuss with them a light water reactor. The fact that it's our conclusion they don't want to give up their weapons is also supported by what the North Koreans have said on many occasions. And indeed, as I mentioned the other day, it appears that what they learned from the Libya crisis is not that Gaddafi should have done more democratic and economic things for his public, but rather that he should never have given up his nuclear weapons in 2003. So with that in mind, I think we have to look at the prospect of a grand bargain in terms of trying to see if we can create the conditions by which North Korea will be willing to change its policy. That is, we have to create the conditions where North Korea will say, for the right mixture of incentives, we are prepared to give up our nuclear weapons and all our nuclear programs. That is, live up to their obligations in the September 05 statement. Now, I think it's important, though, to bear in mind that we cannot imagine any and all elements that could induce North Korea to give up their nuclear weapons. For example, North Korea may be willing to give up their nuclear weapons if the United States gives up all of its nuclear weapons. North Korea may be willing to give up its nuclear weapons if South Korea surrenders and agrees to be part of North Korea. So clearly there are certain elements that are beyond the bounds. So what we need to do is find a sort of reasonable expectation of what could be, of what North Korea could receive in return. I think if we can create that those conditions for North Korea to give up its weapons, a big if, we could probably assemble the right number of elements such that we could reach a grand bargain. I very much sympathize, I very much support the idea that we don't want to go on sort of incremental, step-by-step processes for the rest of history. So after all, we have been there, done that. What we really need is to get things on the table and see what is possible. Now, in terms of getting North Korea to the point where they are prepared for a reasonable price to give up their nuclear programs or nuclear weapons and all their nuclear programs, I think we have to look at a number of incentives, that is, disincentives for them. For example, we'd have to look at a sanctions regime that everybody would truly respect, and not just nominally, but truly respect. In this regard, when you look at developments in recent years, you see that South Korea's trade with North Korea has pretty much atrophied down to nothing, which is a sign of, I think, pushing the North Koreans. But at the same time, China's trade with North Korea has actually increased. And I think, as John Park pointed out, we see a bit of a contradiction between China's desire to chair the six-party process, to support the September 05 joint statement on the one hand, and on the other hand, in effect, taking advantage of South Korea living up to its obligations under the overall denuclearization proposals, taking advantage of that by, in effect, substituting foreign trade for receding South Korean foreign trade. So I think one of the first things is that if we're going to have sanctions programs, everyone needs to join in the letter and the spirit of those, and that includes the country with by far the largest land border with North Korea, that is China. I think we need to continue to pressure North Korea in a way that North Korea will begin to come to terms with the fact that the cost of having those nuclear weapons exceeds it would exceed the risks, their perceived risks of getting rid of them. In this regard, I think it is important to keep the elements of the grand bargain on the table to show North Korea that, in fact, there's a different future. I, however, do not believe, based on my 4 years of having dealt with the North Koreans, I do not believe the notion that the reason they have nuclear weapons is somehow defensive and somehow to protect themselves. It is very instructive that whenever there are military tensions on the Korean Peninsula, certainly in the last couple of years, North Korea has increasingly mentioned its nuclear weapons as a threat in the context of those crises. In short, I think the prospect of North Korea consolidating a nuclear weapons position would be that North Korea would then not just use these as some sort of last stage defensive line, but rather as a first stage offensive way of somehow getting more support from other countries in the region. That is, somehow buying themselves into a club through the use not of a strong economy, but rather of nuclear weapons. So I think we need to really put pressure on them. We need to put pressure on them through UN resolutions. We need to make very clear that they will have a very uncertain future as long as they keep those weapons. As I mentioned the other day, I think one of the big problems is we have not invested enough in trying to stop their acquisition of parts for uranium enrichment. After all, I must say, when I've looked at some of the assets we brought to bear on North Korea, it has been a fraction of the assets we brought to bear on the situation in Iraq. So I think every country, including the U.S., needs to make this a higher priority. I think, again, if we are able to establish the conditions where North Korea sees that holding these weapons is more costly than not holding them, than giving them up, then I think the grand bargain is the right way to go. I think all elements ought to be on the table. I think the sequencing of the elements, I'm less concerned about that, provided there's a tight sequencing and events move very quickly and that we don't have long timeouts between the negotiations. In that event, I think we can move forward and get to the point where North Korea will finally give up these nuclear weapons and perhaps buy themselves an opportunity to exist in the future. One final point is a point I've made many, many times. I think the international community does have different approaches, different thoughts on how this issue can be dealt with. Grand bargain is certainly one of my favorite approaches. But at the end of the day, we must all understand that we do not have the option of simply walking away from this problem. This problem is going to get worse unless we tackle it. So just like a lot of things in life, we need to be prepared to stick with this if we find a solution. Thank you very much.